So ABC News and the Washington Post conducted a poll of all Americans, and they found some results that should be kind of encouraging for Democrats. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So the biggest news of the poll is that for the first time in quite some time, the Democrats are actually leading on the generic ballot question. On the question of if the election for the U.S. House of Representatives were being held today, would you vote for or lean toward the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate in your congressional district? And that's among registered voters. And right now, Democrats are leading by a margin of 46 to 45. Now, granted, that margin is probably within the margin of error. Nevertheless, it's a big improvement over what we've seen for some time, where Democrats have been trailing by as much as 12 points on the generic ballot question. Now, this question can be critical, as it's clear that given gerrymandering and the inherent advantage Republicans have in the Senate, Democrats probably need to win the popular vote by as much as 2 to 3 percentage points to be able to hold on to the House, so it appears that that number is actually heading in the right direction. What's more is this poll also showed that President Biden's approval rating has ticked up a little bit. He's up to 42% approval, which, although lower than I'd like for sure, it's still an improvement over his low point a couple months ago. What's more is this poll also shows that for the first time, voters are giving Democrats credit for getting control of the pandemic. 51% of the voters give President Biden and the Democrats credit for taking control of this problem, and that's up from a low of 44% in February, so a big improvement. Now, this data, though, also shows what the Democrats' problem is, which is that voters have kind of taken the attitude of, what have you done for me lately? So while there's growing enthusiasm for the way the Democrats have handled the pandemic, which up until recently was the dominant issue that Americans were concerned about, now voters have kind of shifted their attention to the economy and inflation in particular. And there, unfortunately, Democrats aren't doing quite as well. By a margin of 57 to 38, Americans disapprove of the way President Biden has handled the economy, and that's really driven by the issue of inflation, where 68% of people disapprove of his handling of the issue. A big issue, though, that comes through in this poll is despite the fact that the Democrats' numbers seem to be improving somewhat, there remains a big-time enthusiasm gap. Overall, 42% of the voters, almost all of the ones who say they disapprove of his performance, say they disapprove of his performance strongly. While among those who approve of his performance, only about half of them, 21%, say they strongly approve. So in other words, there's a real enthusiasm gap there. What's more is that by a 10-point margin, Republicans have said that they're more likely to vote in the November election than Democrats. And that's really where our problem is. But it's also where we have an opportunity. I mean, two things stand out at me from the data in this poll. The first one is that this poll was taken before we got news about the Supreme Court striking down abortion. But according to this poll, by a margin of 54% to 28%, Americans do not support overturning Roe v. Wade. What's more is 7 in 10 Americans say that the decision of whether or not a woman can have an abortion should be left to the woman and her doctor. And 57% say they oppose a ban after 15 weeks, what the Mississippi legislation that said issue does. So my guess is that the Supreme Court's action is going to be something that's going to perhaps light a fire a little bit under some of the Democrats and make them realize how much is at stake if they don't vote. The second thing I find encouraging is the fact that people are so focused on inflation right now, and indeed, inflation is a problem right now. But yet the other big piece of news from the other day is that the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates by a 0.5 percentage point, which is a huge jump compared to what the Fed has done in the past. So what that means is the Fed is taking aggressive action to address inflation. My guess is if we start to see positive motion on inflation as we start to get into the fall, which could happen, you're going to see the Democrats' numbers improve substantially in that area. And given the fact that President Biden's numbers are already improving and the generic ballot is already improving for Democrats, and hopefully by the fall we'll also be starting to see some positive news coming out of Ukraine, we can start to see a framework where all of a sudden the pessimism that so many Democrats have had might not be what becomes the reality. In other words, it's not time to give up hope yet. If you want to see some other videos I've made about how Democrats can improve their polling numbers, why don't you check out this video I made quite some time ago. There I talk about how on economic issues, Democrats are still strong. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.